Sure everybody's muted. All right. Just waiting for it to log in. All right, welcome everybody. We are going live right now, so let's get this show on the road. Everybody, welcome. This is Black History Month here at the Afro-American Academy. We want to thank everybody for joining us today. We have a great episode of Pathways to Understanding some of our cultural diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculum development here at the Afro-American Academy. And we want to thank and welcome Marisol, Jackie, and Brenda for welcoming us today. If you can quickly give us a 1-2 minute, just how you doing? How you doing today?
Hi, Marlon. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Excited for the conversation.
Yes, thank you. I'm honored to join you guys here today.
It's lovely. So this programming, like I said, is part of the Boston Red Line 85, where we mark 85 years of the Red Line map. So we've been sponsored by the City of Boston Office of Equity and Inclusion, as well as the Black Male Advancement Office, and a number of other organizations, you know, to share information to communities in regards to redlining and how it's important and what needs to be done to rectify some of the issues that face some of our multicultural communities. One of the issues that we're dealing with, especially in Black History Month, is that, you know, even currently, Black history is being banned in certain parts of this country. So it's very important that we understand where we are on the front lines of making sure that our oral history is being preserved, our oral history that, you know, this is the way we practice it. Right, and we have a lot of, you know, in our communities, especially the Indigenous African American community, because of, you know, the many years of not even really having access to practice land to practice their culture. There's been a lot of degradation and over the years that now makes it difficult even to communicate with other cultures. So this part of the development is to make sure that African American cultural competency now will have the Afro-Latin flavor in our curriculum. So we're very happy to go on this journey together. So with that, real quick, just to pay some bills, with the Afro-American Culture Initiative, Boston-based nonprofit. I am the founder, Marlon Solomon. We build cultural bridges in African diaspora through education, technology, and travel. We're a restorative project management firm that designs and builds systems that build community repair, harm, and promote inclusivity. The Afro-American Academies are student-led after school and summer school educational and employment program to help young people develop curriculum and operate our Afro-American TV, which is the show that we're on now, which is our platform that hopefully one day it'll be students asking you these questions and not me. And I can not retire, but I can be in the back somewhere. So that's the dream, and that's where we're developing here. So your content today, we want to thank all our panelists for joining us, because what they're doing is helping us develop curriculum that is culturally competent for our young people. Just a quick shout out to my man, Sharif the artist. He makes these wonderful black cards, are great gifts. He's been donating them to us to give to our young people as a learning tool that makes you see that it's important that your representation is everywhere, even on the cards that we play. So you can check him out at www.sharifmohammed.com. These are my students that worked on this program. We have Boston Public School kids as well as Northeastern kids. And Inkiru, as you met, she's not feeling well, so we want to send our love out to her today and get well. These are my students that helped work on this. I want to thank them for all their hard work. So our story starts in Boston with the Boston Red Line 85 map. The Red Line map was issued February 1st, 1938. So we realized that is also the beginning of Black History Month, and that's why we chose the whole month to have a series of events to illustrate the Black History Month for the kind of Black history that we are interested in developing. Right now, you're seeing your picture of the Dudley Street Baptist Church, which was a church which was destroyed in the urban renewal, along with 60% of the Indigenous African American community. This is now the current site of a library, but this library does not make any mention of this church because the history is almost lost. We found it on a map, and that's how we were able to bring it out. So that's why this place is called Dudley Square, and there's so many stories about it. But this church is very important, not because of the religion part per se. Of course, that's important. You know, that's our thing. God is always first. But you know that this is a space. As an engineer, I'm concerned with what these spaces are used for. In segregation, these communities had to use all the space at their very best in order to survive. So they use these spaces were like choirs, right? Access to instruments, access safe, encouraging environment where they're encouraged to sing, right? These are the spaces that created Aretha Franklin. They were not accepting people of color in Berkeley, or the best schools. So these are the breeding grounds for the cultural development. And when you destroy these communities, these spaces that also taught people to cook, you also now make it so that the cultural loss over a couple of generations now is at a lower level than it was back then. So we're taking data on this stuff, but the main thing is that the Aretha Franklin generation, that was one of the greatest musicians with a lot of musical talent and people with skills, when they were displaced, the 60% of the community, these places got degraded, like I said. And then the cultural development has halted, and this generation cannot play the instruments as well. To let you know that the relationship in redlining was worldwide. Every dot represents a red line map. So this was done to every community, primarily people of color, but also ethnic minorities like Italians, Irish, Polish, Jewish. They were also targeted by yellow lining and red lining. So this is the Green Book, which demonstrates the safe spaces across the United States in which people of color used to travel in the Green Book economy, making money, through entertainment and and playing music and things like that. And this showed them the safe spaces where they could go in America and not have any trouble. For people who don't know, the red line map took areas of the country, of the cities, and make them into different grades. For great, blue for good but not still desirable, yellow for hazardous, and then yellow definitely declining, and red hazardous. All right. So I want to talk about the relationship between culture, land, and law. You need safe spaces like the church or somewhere where people can practice their culture. In places in the Caribbean and Latin America, a lot of the former slaves were able to have land in either Colomboes, in the different parts of, in the forest, or the Maroons in Jamaica. They were able to find safe spaces to practice their culture and transfer this information to the next generation. This has been because of these churches were the only places. Remember, in Boston, you could only go to they could not go to many percentages of the city. They could only stay within this red area, and they couldn't go outside of these areas. And in Boston, there are three major communities that were destroyed: the Italian community, the West End, the African American community, like I've mentioned. 60% of that community was leveled, and then the Jewish community was pushed out. Even though their community wasn't leveled, they were pushed out, and 68,000 Jews were expelled from this area in the 60s in Boston. So these all represent cultural hubs. This is what redlining did. It identified where the cultural hubs were, and then later on in urban renewal, this happened 25 years after the zip code happened 25 years after the red line map, and then they took out some of the areas that were redlined. These are some pictures of some of the Jewish temples that still are in the communities of color today. These are leftover artifacts from that era. And this is this is the West End, the Italian areas. You can see that big patch of land was once a community, a multicultural community with people from all over who were in that area. So that is what we have for redlining. So hope you check out more of our information that we have, right? And now we're going to go on to the main show. But before we get started, we want all our people online to to now join us on Slido. All right, we're going to go to Slido, and then you can put in on your phone, right? And you can participate. So if that's QR code has an easy link as well. And what we want you to do is to help as they're talking. If there's something that if our panelists are saying that you agree with, or you think needs to be taught to the kids, or you just want to highlight it more, please add your voice to it. So we're going to do a couple of test things before we get started. But yeah, the idea is that we're going to now get our panelists to talk, and you'll be able to sign up on Slido with your QR code. So get your phones handy. So without further ado, enough of me talking. All right, let me turn off this and I'll bring it back on when we need to. Okay, hold on. It's not the scene I want. Like I said, it's easier when other people are doing it. All right, so we'll manage this until I get something more. All right, so welcome, ladies. Thank you for being part of this process. I can't wait to get you guys started on your questions and stuff. So how's everything going? I mean, how's everything going for Black History Month and everything?
Good. I think we'll get started if you don't mind turning it over to me. Do you want to share the video? Oh, let's get you started with Slido.
So we can get started. Yes.
Yeah, perfect.
All right, so
I think I would pick the one with the heart eyes. That's the one.
All right, excellent.
Brenda, what are you picking? Number 2?
Number 2.
Yeah. Okay. And Jackie, how about you?
You know what? I am thinking that if that number 1 is just sort of slumping in that chair a little bit, I'm getting over a cold, so I'm kind of, slumping.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm in love with this panel, so that's why.
And I'm a 5.
You're a 5.
I'm just like this is my last virtual. So I have one. I have a in person on Saturday, and I'm done. But we did like 14 events, so we're,
That's fair. That's fair.
Wow. No. All right. Well, please, people sign on. All right. So this is where we wanted to collect a little data on some of the people that are participating. So like I said, you can go to slido.com. You can put in 1542231. And please, panelists, if you please join in, because as other people are talking, there's something you want to highlight. Please do so if you can get your phones. And this is just us. Like I said, we do not use racial constructs in our programming. We always talk about cultural and what what culture do you come from, because we want to learn more about you and want to know more about who you are and the content of your character. Not okay. Welcome, Janice. We got Janice on the line. Good evening. All right. Welcome. Janice has been so great. She's been coming to all our events in person.
Thank you.
Welcome. All right, excellent. Okay, so you guys can sign on. We have 4 signed on. Okay, excellent. All right. We have 5. All right, so let's go to the next. Come on, let's get this thing. Oh wow, we have a great diversity. Great diversity. I love it. Everybody. Nice. Love it. Love it. Love it. Love it. Love it. All right. All right. So do you think Indigenous African American culture is under attack? Our story is like because of the cultural, we have to create our names. We're creating culture like Kwanzaa and other things. There's a lot of cultural development that's going on that we still need to work on. But nonetheless, the history we even to say our history, when they try to ban history, they're banning African Americans specifically because it tells on their ancestors, so there's this uncomfortable thing that we have to do, right? All right, so let's see what we have here. All right. So now for the first question, you guys can go right ahead. For many, the term Afro-Latina, Afro-Puerto Rican was something they didn't have growing up, and now it's an identity that truly embodies their truth. How do you identify? One can go.
So do you want us to do the conversation now, Marlon?
Yeah. That's your first question that we had on the thing.
Well, my first question was for both Jackie and Brenda. If you can share a little bit about who you are and where you grew up, I think that's a good space to set the context for then this identity question. So, Jackie, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So I grew up, I'm Jackie Lazoo. I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut. I was born and raised in the US. Puerto Rican parents. My parents came from Puerto Rico in the late 60s. And so that makes a big difference. I mean, that geographic space and time is very different from the one that I find myself in now. For the last 20 years, I've lived in Chicago. And I would say that one of the main differences for me in terms of how that shaped my identity is that I grew up in a community that, obviously the state of Connecticut is a state that is almost 80% white. The city of Hartford is almost 80% people of color. So it's like deep northern segregation. But also at the time, it was a community that was like very, it was homogenous in some ways, right? In the sense that we were mostly all people of color, but also very, very Caribbean. That's why I love to see like Afro-Caribbean as a way to identify specifically in that list. And I kind of gravitated toward that as I was answering it because, Hartford at the time was like Puerto Rican, African-American, and West Indian. And so the tone of the city, like, the identity politics was really about understanding ourselves as Black people, especially because of the nature of the migration that went back east at that time, right? Like people from the coast, people who, had Afro-Boricua roots, So, I wouldn't say that, I immediately understood myself as Black because that would be naive. We were, constantly, dealing with our own racism as a people, as Latinos, as Puerto Rican, internal and external. But I think that from my positionality now, I understood a lot of my, negotiating my identity as a kid really was about responding to racism, responding to discrimination. And so, even though back then I wouldn't have understood it as like my parents really teaching me how to be Afrocentric, like in retrospect, that's exactly what it was, So for that reason, I identify as, either Afro-Latina or Afro-Boricua, but I also understand those two to be very different, right? Because in Latin America, each and every country understands Blackness in a different way, right? So, and in Puerto Rico, where we have this kind of like this myth of racial equality, we have to negotiate race in a very different way because people assign it and understand it in different ways. So I don't want to get too much into that, but for me now, what Marlon was saying, like the idea of being able to say, like, to own that identity, has been really important to me. I'm glad that it's part of the discourse that we're negotiating now, and I'm willing to sit and explain it if I need to, because it's been an important part of understanding myself and owning my background.
And Brenda, how about you?
Wow. That's an incredible, and thank you, Jackie, for that context, because it just make my mind spin And I have my apologies ahead of time. My dog decided to bring her barking machine with her along while I, unmuted myself. So my name is Brenda Torres Figueroa, hyphenated. I use both of my parents' name, both my father and mother. I was born and raised and educated in Puerto Rico. I'm from Fajardo, that is an east coast town, northeast coast town in the island. So I identify myself as negra puertorriqueña. Cálmate. Cálmate. You were so nice. Um, and in here, right, in Chicago, and as I arrived like 23 years ago, like literally half of my life, um, I had, as Jackie was saying, like negotiating those different identities that expand our Latinidad, because we are not just Latinas. I don't want to talking about negotiation. She just don't want to hear me talking. So I was born, as I said, I was born, raised, and educated in Puerto Rico. Um, my family from my father's side is mainly Afro-Puertorriqueños or Negros Puertorriqueños, all to the line of 7, 8, 9, 10 generations. And then from my mother's side, we have more like a Portuguese and a Spanish side. And what does that mean in terms of the composition of myself, right? As identifying as a negra puertorriqueña, right? When I have all these identities within, and obviously I'm visible, I'm visibly black in the eyes of many people that say, I thought you were black when I came here to Chicago. And I'm like, I am black. But that also helped me negotiate as well. What does that mean of being black in the United States? What does that mean being black in Puerto Rico? Who gets to call you black? Who gets to like instigate that kind of dialogue within yourself, like internal and external, about who you are and where do you belong, right? Because that also comes with the process of the territory and the space and feeling safe and all of that. So yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, that makes me think of, my own upbringing, born and raised in Chicago. My family came in the late 40s, early 50s. My dad's side of the family is from Yauco, and my mom's side of the family is from Cañito in the San Juan metropolitan area, Rio Piedras. And so, for me, my father is very light skinned. My mom was darker skin, and we never really kind of talked about growing up this kind of being kind of Afro Puerto Rican. It wasn't, we were just Puerto Rican. And there was that myth that Jackie kind of spoke to about sort of the equality of being all three, right? We're a mixture of all three. That's the narrative. There's no nuance to it. And it really wasn't until I got older and I started learning more about like the history of the island and the migration and, even things about, what slavery looked like on the island, that I began to really interrogate my identity and see it differently, right? And I even had family members who would be like, this is on my mom's side of the family who are also visibly Black, not identify as that, right? Or not wanting to be associated with being like African American, and so the Puerto Rican kind of covered everything, I guess, is the way they thought about it. But I do remember these distinct comments in the way that colorism played out in my family, whether it was my dad's mother who had straight hair, combing my hair when I was little, and when she came into tangles, would call them King Kongs, right? You're trying to straighten my hair and running into what she called King Kongs, and how those, that's racialized. Or, my Black grandmother being like, "Oh, you don't love me because I'm Black," and it was like, what? Where's this coming from? And as a kid, not really being able to understand all of that. And I feel also like Chicago wasn't like New York or the East Coast that had this real mix of Puerto Ricans looking like a little bit of everything. Like the Afro-Puerto Rican community in Chicago, I feel is very small in comparison because of where the towns where people came from tended to be from like more mountain areas, right? That tended to be whiter. And so they also had the luxury, I think, of not even having to sort of think about it or engage in a more complex discussion about the way race showed up within the context of Puerto Rican identity. So thank you. Let's move on to the next question. I think we kind of talked a little bit about it, but then how do you identify now here? How have you thought about nuancing that that identity? And what I want to share is actually something that made me think about this question, or actually draw from this question. I was looking on Instagram, and there was this post that said, Afro-Latinas are not Black women, they are Afro-Latinas. And just, what do you think, like, how do you feel about that? Do you feel like that's your truth? Or how does that term like land on you? We'll start with Brenda, I guess, this time.
Okay, can you see me well? I'm kind of seeing on this side kind of frozen, so I'm not I'm not sure. Are we get okay, perfect. Okay. So going back to the theme of negotiating, right? I'm a native speaker, a Spanish speaker, right? I'm very proud of my of my what they call Puerto Rican grandma accent, abuela accent, right? And that's also part of me holding on to my Latino identity or Latina identity, right? That sometimes is very confrontational because, as I said, not only people in the Black communities were like, well, I thought you were Black, but also Latinos thought that, I was not one of them, right? Even Puerto Rican people in the neighborhood were very conflicted, as Marisol was saying, of seeing me as one of coming from Puerto Rico. And when I said like, okay, I'm from Puerto Rican, and it was like, are you from Loíza, or are you from Ponce, or are you from the coastal towns? It was never from Fajardo. It was never impossible from San Juan. It was never impossible from any of the places that many of the Puerto Rican people came. That we're talking about the center of the island. We're talking about Ciales, Utuado, Sidra, like, some of the central towns that we know as the mountains, right? San Sebastian as well. We have a lot of people from San Sebastian, and you don't see that that there were a lot of mix, or many people that were dark skinned or negro puertorriqueños. So for me it was very revealing to kind of not only have to negotiate my identity as a Black Puerto Rican, or just period as a Puerto Rican, with Blacks in Chicago, but also with Latinos in Chicago, and also with my own people in Chicago, right? And I felt that we needed to have a process of reconnection and solidarity in terms of understanding that we are beyond that mixture, right? And I was also confronted with the Puerto Rican community with the three races myth, right? That, oh, we don't talk about race because we are part of, my grandmother was as blacker than yours. Everybody that I met has a blacker grandmother than me, just to justify, right? That they were not having a problem with la negritud, right? Which I found that it was very amusing, right? Because that doesn't mean that you have to walk the shoes of, you know, that you have to walk the shoes of somebody that is visibly Black. So here in the United States, I continue. I'm negra puertorriqueña in the whole Spanish realm, negra puertorriqueña. I can be Afro puertorriqueña, and that's how I, because mainly because I'm my native language, right? And I feel very connected to my culture and geographically with Puerto Rico because I was born and raised, and that's my language there.
Yeah, I mean, I want to respond to the meme, and say that these are identity politics. And so that meme is real. There's somebody who feels that way, right? There's somebody who feels like their racial identity has to be understood in that way, and and it may not feel good to me, right? As someone who is really trying to, like, I want to be able to, especially as someone who comes from a space like Brenda has described, where we are so in Puerto Rico and in Puerto Rican culture, we need to understand things in the formula that we've made up, that is not the binary way that we understand race in the US. It's not the black and white. Like, the vast majority of Puerto Ricans actually look a little bit more like me, right? Like, they are mixed. They're racially mixed, right? It's a nation that, unlike a lot of the other Caribbean countries, like, there was racial mixture right away historically, right? So somehow, despite the fact that we are so mixed, that, like Brenda says, everybody's abuela es más negra que tú, y tu abuela donde está, we have all these sayings about it. Like, we assign blackness to one group of people and whiteness to another too, and everybody else in between gets to sit in silence and not choose a name or be assigned like whatever we appear to be to people, trigueño, jabao. Like, we are, very much a product of that caste system. We use it with the majority of our people. For me, it is very important, for my political identity, to claim, Afro-Boricua identity, Afro-Latina, depending on the context. Again, there's a space where each one of those needs to be negotiated for me. But I do, I celebrate the fact that, thanks a lot to Black American women, like, there's a discourse that we are able to use, frankly, to be able to talk about ourselves too. So, I'm a firm believer in, like, there's places where I need to know how to step in and assert myself. And then there are other places where I need to know how to step back. I know what places and the privileges that I carry into each space, and all of that is important. So I don't, I can't say that I, resent someone who thinks that way, right? Like, in the way of that meme, because I understand it. Like, that is a way of thinking that is very much, rooted in pains here, in struggles here in the US. And so I honor that.
Yeah, no, thank you both. I mean, it makes me think about just growing up and always, people ask me, well, what are you? Or you don't look Puerto Rican, or all of these sort of myths of what a Puerto Rican looks like and how to negotiate that. And so I think, I came to that, my own understanding of my Afro-Boricua identity really in college, when I was exposed to more of it and had some language to be able to talk about it and think about it more critically, and the ways in which those aspects of me, showed up in whatever space. And so, even thinking about sort of Blackness more broadly than just African American, the Afro-Caribbean, the diaspora conversations, and that connectedness that we can have through a Pan-African identity, which I think raises a lot of affirmations for those of us who have felt marginalized, even within the context of our own communities. Marlon, did you want to add anything or say anything? Came back on screen.
Well, one thing that I'm getting from the conversation is very interesting is that, the Portuguese and Spanish, one of the things, the difference between them and the British and the French is that they do, like, you said, race mixing immediately. Like, they go into a place and then they say, everybody here is going to be Portuguese by the time we're done with you. And I think that is playing out in this cultural thing where it's like race versus culture. There's this balance that I'm kind of like trying to like get. I'm understanding it more through your conversation, but that's where my head is going. So But then we can go to the next question. I mean, that's all I wanted to say. That's what I'm gathering. This like mixture of like, okay, how do I identify with race and how do I identify like with my culture? And then there's this like battle because in English and French terms, you're separate. So it's easy to say race and culture are kind of easy, but when you're kind of like, on purpose, a blend of multicultural wonderfulness, right? From all sorts of everything, then your identity now is kind of like, I don't know, like I get it, I think I get it.
I mean, our identity is a result of colonialism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when people comment about my eyes, oftentimes I think, yes, they're the colonizer's eyes. Like these are the things that we may be a mix, and that may be beautiful now, but it didn't start off that way. And I think there was a deep level of erasure that happened, and the reason why, at least in the case of Puerto Rico, this separate kind of Puerto Rican identity came into play was because Spain left for a long time, didn't do much, and so the people who were there had to create their own society. Think about the trading that they had to do with other islands in the Caribbean as the independence wars were taking place in Latin America. A lot of those folks who were still loyal to the crown fled to Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico tends to be a little bit whiter than maybe some other places in the Caribbean, right? And so all of these are, all of our identity is a mix of this sort of colonial politics that ended up, coming together on this island. And you also had the mixture of the Tainos. And I think for a long time, there was this erasure that happened as well. Or the stories of our maroon societies, right? And the ways that they resisted. And so it's a culture that had to develop on its own, that has
Right.
this distinctness, and that we still are faced with that in the midst of colonialism that we're experiencing from the United States and our resistance, right? We still speak Spanish on an island that's been colonized by the United States for over 100 years, right? That is culture. That
Right.
Resistance.
Right.
And I just wanted to add that, to your point, the caste system, right? Like the Spanish caste system, which wasn't ever really used in its entirety. It was just sort of created. I mean, there are vestiges of it, but it was all sort of designed, and all the names were really about the proximity to whiteness after a while. Like the closer you got to it, the names themselves celebrated the whiteness, right? And your proximity to it. And so I think a lot of that, the vestiges of that definitely have affected identity formation in Puerto Rico. And to your point, Mari, even the census will show you that people, by and large, still are, aiming for white in terms of even the way they understand themselves. And yet I can't think of a less white culturally space than Puerto Rico in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. Like the essence of the culture of Puerto Rico and the way that we transplant it either here, there, or globally is very much like embedded in Afro-Boricua, culture and expressive culture, especially. So that's the irony of it.
Brenda, do you want to add anything?
I think, like, I'm a big fan of talking about how, the influence on not only like being visibly Black, but it's also part of who we are in our music, particularly in our food. We have so many food items that are like, what they call, I get really, really disappointed when I go to a Puerto Rican restaurant in Chicago and they have in the menu Spanish rice. And when you see it, it's arroz con gandules, that is rice with pigeon peas. Both items came from Africa. The pigeon peas from Ghana and the rice as well. So our staple food is actually rooted in Africa. Our mofongo, which is a big cousin of a fufu, right? And mango, right? And we have the essence of the plantain, right? That is like, and I put my hand in my heart because I'm all about food and culinary stuff and the culinary arts that we inherited from our ancestors. My grandmother taught me how to cook, and I did this comparison. Both of them taught me how to cook. One of them would do pipiana, which is bacalao, codfish, with green papaya and coconut milk, and the other one will make bacalao a la vizcaína, which is a Spanish-based kind of stewish bacalao that has like maybe 13 or 14 ingredients. So you see, like they live like probably like a block apart, one of them in very different houses, just because. And I didn't want it to realize it's just because the color of their skin, but also how they internalize their identities growing up in Puerto Rico. So for me, like, it is always very important to look at this idea of resistance and how it's manifested in so many works and forms and art, and art that is deliberate about liberation, right? And so for me, it's very important to kind of see the root of everything and how we reclaim all those aspects of our culture, and rebuild from that, and rebuild our identities as a culture from an understanding and visibilizing the contribution of Afro Puerto Ricans or Negro Puerto Ricanos into the mix. And yeah.
That's great. That when you were talking about like the comparison of what your two grandmothers made, I started thinking about that too, and I was like, wow, that's very, very true, right? So talk to us about how Blackness was celebrated or not in your household growing up or in your upbringing. Jackie, do you want to start?
Sure. Again, I'm speaking from the positionality of now, like a middle-aged woman looking back, because I think that there were a lot of things that I was being that were being celebrated that at the time I interpreted as just getting through moments, like dealing with discrimination, like, my dad, my family. I think that by nature of coming to the United States as a Black man, as a Black Puerto Rican man, and being immediately identified first as Black American, and sort of almost using Puerto Ricanness as a defense, right? Letting people know, "No, I'm actually Puerto Rican," and hearing those stories and seeing my dad, especially because his family was the one that migrated. My mom came by herself, so her family was not what guided us, right? Like my experience and my upbringing was rooted in my dad's family, which was a Black Puerto Rican family. So that's, again, that influenced me very much. And the ways that we resisted and the things that we, did to deal with those moments, I think now are parts of the things that I celebrate as having grown up in my family, right? But more importantly, for me, it was also, my religion is that I, come from a long line of practitioners of the Lugumi religion, the Yoruba religion, or as I knew it, I did not know it as that. I knew it as Ocha or Santeria, which was, of course, the pejorative term. But that's how we knew it, right? Because we practiced it in that way. We practiced it alongside Catholicism and as a syncretized religion. It's a religion that I learned how to embrace as an African-based religion when I was a teenager, right? So growing up, that's not how I understood it. And it did take running into people who knew it as an African religion, and it was mostly African American women who, taught me about my religion, right? Who practiced it in a way that was Afrocentric, that was, going back to Ifa, going back to your home place, Marlon, right? Nigeria, and understanding the roots of it in a different way. What's that?
I can't wait to get in this. This is exactly where all that synchronized. Go ahead.
Yeah, so and then people going back and discovering that that's not, it no longer exists in that way, and then understanding that my ancestors preserved it, right? That it was, the religion that I understood to be Cuban and Puerto Rican actually had this whole other cosmology, this whole other legacy that I was learning about, but that, at the end of the day, it was also like this deep appreciation for the resilience of my ancestors and having preserved that, right? So all of that I understood much later, and I was able to teach it to my children, who are also like, um, are also children of faith because of that, and they get to understand it in a completely different way, and in a way that truly celebrates Blackness, right, and truly celebrates our African roots, yeah, in a way that I didn't have. So I can't think of a better example of how how I honor what my parents taught me, what my grandparents taught me, in terms of our Afrocentric roots, than the ability to continue to practice a religion that was so, that has been so mystical, and has been marginalized, but at the same time, like really, really incredibly preserved for hundreds of years, by our ancestors.
Thanks. What about you, Brenda?
Well, growing up in Puerto Rico with my abuela, and I got that sense of pride of being, the darker in the room most of the time, right? And I feel like they embracing me, not only, okay, you are the darker, you have to work harder, right? And you have to make yourself being seen, right? Through working hard, to having the best grades, to be involved in everything. So I was very avid and participatory in every single. I was the president of my class. I was doing the most, right? Being extra all the time. So celebrating who I was and how I look like in Puerto Rico, it was mostly a frame through this culture of you have to do more, right? You always have to show up more. You have to go there earlier. You have to demonstrate that you're worth it, right? Talking back to, having this conversation that I still have every day with my grandmother, Ana Pucha, she used to tell me, like, and this is the part that was celebrated or not, right? She used to tell me, you have to marry lighter, right? Tienes que mejorar la raza, which means that you have to better the race. And this was my black grandmother that come from a lineage of paleras, right? Of practitioners of Palo Mayombe in Fajardo. They were known as the two main, as one of her sisters explained, witches, right? And practitioners of Espiritismo and Palo Mayombe. So I discovered this information only a few months ago, right? And I discovered that they were like my next generation to me, that are my parents, were in complete denial of those kind of any kind of religion that were coming from Africa, even though that they were very well aware of their pride as being the darker in the room as well, right? So for me, that was always very conflicting, because I did not grow up with a religion. I was, I always like to go with my other abuela to the temple of the Jehovah Witnesses, but that was not my religion, right? And so I also have that side of feeling completely disconnected spiritually from my land and who I was, right? And my even my family members, and that erasure, just because they were afraid that I was discriminated. And it's so interesting, because it was not until I got in here in the United States that I realized that people were able to practice your beautiful African religions freely, right? And for me, that was completely, like an amazing revelation. So I started like kind of investigating more, not just as a practice, but through my work, through my artwork, and kind of celebrating in many ways and forms the history of my grandmothers, the history of those tias, right? That word became invisible, the history of my abuela, the history of a lineage of of people and their stories and what they meant to me, now that I can elevate their presence and I can elevate who they were as they wanted to be, right? So that's why I'm negotiating as well, like, the celebration of my blackness now and every day and in the future, even though that I didn't have that opportunity in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like very similar to that myself. It wasn't something in my family that was necessarily celebrated. And the occasions that it was talked about, it was as if it was something wrong, or we would hear the stories of my grandfather was from Utuado, and his family was, very fair skinned, and he basically was disowned by his family for marrying my Black grandmother, and that was kind of the story within the family. And so I could tell with especially aunts and uncles who were darker skinned, and even with my grandmother, that there was this, sort of internalized racism and negativity towards it, and not something that was celebrated. It wasn't really, again, until I was in college where I got to really learn about the history and culture, introduced to things like bomba, or the religion, that I began to kind of see the fullness of my Puerto Rican-ness and understand myself more, because I think, I grew up in a time where, my dad was, part of that affirmative action generation, right? And so he was part of that generation of colorblindness and multiculturalism and all of this. And, very much in the, anything you put your mind to, you work hard, you can do it. And, so like growing up there, and fortunately, we grew up in one of the most diverse areas in Chicago, West Rogers Park at the time. And so, like, there was a little bit of everything there. And so we did grow up in this very, like, religiously diverse community, ethnically diverse community. And so there was this color blindness that I think not until high school, and then definitely in college, that I began to really understand, and then understand my own place in it. But it really came as an adult, and making the choice to embrace it and celebrate it. Yeah, thank you. So let's get back to a little bit of history. So it feels like, and I don't know, Marlon, did you want to jump into this conversation? I know that you
well, just briefly, because so I'm very interested in this topic because, well, obviously I come from Nigeria, and would you believe that? So, that religion is a monotheistic religion. It has one supreme God, and that is why it was able to merge with the Christianity in otherwise they're obviously praying to the same people, otherwise it would not join. So the synchronization and all that, I am very interested in learning, because the Yoruba people that went in the Spanish times, right, with the Portuguese, those ones were allowed to practice their culture, and they hid it behind, that story. But when they went back home, when the British came, the British convinced the Africans that was ugly, and that was terrible. So even up to today, people change their names. They don't go by Ogun Tade or Shango Tade, they go by Oluwa Tade, which means God. So they don't want to be called their own. But the thing about it is that is their own saints. Those are intermediaries. They're not people that you are praying to. They're just like Saint Francis or Saint Gregory. So what is so fascinating is how the evidence that it's not dirty is in the Caribbean, and they celebrated more in Brazil with Olodum and all. They celebrated more than they do in Africa now, because in Africa they're ashamed that they consider it to be voodoo when it wasn't. It's an amazing concept, but yeah, I love the concept.
Well, I'll just say, like, I think that this is an incredible moment for my religion, because frankly, I don't want to mislead anyone into thinking that that it was something that was easy for us. It was absolutely not. We were very marginalized. And and the religion is, extremely stigmatized, especially in Puerto Rico. When we got it from
Yes.
Cuba, right? And and as Brenda said, a lot of this really has to do with like the phases of like the slave trade, right? And the fact that we had a lot. I know for a fact that my heritage, my family heritage, is rooted in the Congo, because my grandfathers for generations were nicknamed El Congo. That was literally their nicknames. And so, the oral tradition really kept us very aware of who the people in our family was. So that's not Yoruba, right? That's a whole different, that's a whole different sort of cultural lineage. And so Yoruba for us was a choice, right? It was something that my family started to practice generations ago. But
It's
very
amazing.
much shrouded in secrecy, right? Like shrouded in the mysteries of the religion. And I come from a very Orthodox religious family. So, the way that people celebrate it now and sort of put it out there in pop culture, like to us, that was like a sacrilege. And it's still very
Right.
uncomfortable for me to speak about it.
Yoruba are very culturally strong, and they have all this because it's a hierarchy. It's a beautiful, like we achieved monotheistic, like Judaism or anything. They're praying to the same. Olodumare is just the Yoruba name for Allah or for God. It's just another group of people that achieved it.
Yeah. But
But
to your
that's
point,
beautiful.
absolutely. And, I'll just say that to your point, I will say that even though obviously, the secrecy had a purpose, and many of us still believe that, firmly, at the same time, we did celebrate our names. I'm Oyabiyi. Like we say that with pride in our sacred spaces, right? Like the Orishas, like we identified with them so deeply, right? And we do so with pride. So I will say that is a big difference. And I think, definitely has something to do with the survival of this faith. So
I'm telling you, it was preserved. It is more culturally developed in the Caribbean. Let me say that again. It is more that religion is more culturally developed in the Caribbean, where people were longing for that connection and they needed it. Right. And it worked because all the other religions didn't like, and this is like, there's a Netflix Bigger Than Africa, documentary that kind of goes into the details of the thing. But when you go back, it goes down to the Nok culture, like in ancient Africa, like 700 years, like 400 AD. It goes down to the kingdom of Benin. They now had Oduduwa, who was like a Jesus Christ figure that came and remixed the thing, and then it spread to the Caribbean and preserved there. Because what's in Africa, they're so ashamed. They don't even culturally develop again. I'm telling you, it's an amazing thing. So let me let you guys go. Sorry. Next question. I know.
Those are just, the tactics of colonialism, right? Of the erasure that happened. And again, especially like when we talk about being Puerto Rican, like that kind of seed of resistance is part of who we are from, the time of Spanish colonialism to current U.S. colonialism, right? That insistence on staying connected, I think is one of the things that I'm most proud of, right? Because in spite of it all, we still, move forward. So I want to move on to the next.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Harlan.
No. I'm just gonna say I want to talk to Lou afterwards because I want to know the synchronization, like between the Orishas and the saints, like they used to put names behind. I don't know. I will ask you later, but go ahead. That's so wonderful. I love it. Thank you.
So, so one of the things I feel like is very different between the U.S. and Puerto Rico is that, it feels like there's been an erasure in Puerto Rico about the history of slavery on the island, which was one of the last places to abolish slavery. Slavery ran from 1511 to 1873. And even though it ended technically in 1873, the enslaved people were still required to, be enslaved for 3 more years after the official declaration, so 1876. So how do you think that's impacted our community's understanding of race, racism, and white supremacy on the island and the U.S.? And Brenda, I'll start with you.
Wow, that has been incredibly difficult. That has been like a great challenge because, as I mentioned earlier, we continue promoting this idea of the mix of races, right? That everybody in Puerto Rico has this mix of races, and we shouldn't be talking or looking critically at racism. And I understand it well. Like, we mentioned the the construct of racism here in the United States is very black and white. But what happened to the part in the middle? What happened to the, like, to look at it as a spectrum? What happened when we look at it with the how we internalize racism, right? How do we negotiate those spaces with others that are like not only lighter skin or they have a different shade, but they have, like, different classes, right? That they have different educations, that they have different what they call quote unquote privileges, right? Because they coming from different places, right? And we have also an issue of origin, coming from the island, being raised in here in the United States, like speaking Spanish, not speaking Spanish. So there are so many different things that we have to learn how to navigate and negotiate on a daily basis. There was this detail that we discussed last on our last edition of Afro-Riqueñas, a Segundo Risbelvis, that I think I'm pretty sure that Melanie Maldonado Diaz brought it up. And she's an expert, she's amazing, working with a genealogy. And she mentioned that in the 1820s in Puerto Rico, there were more people, that black people, than there were whites. And that for me, like, wow, that was never documented properly. But we know, right, the history of Puerto Rico and the history of enslavement in Puerto Rico, it was not necessarily documented, or even the artifacts. So if you see, like, the only representation that we have of our ancestors, our black and negros ancestors, our enslaved ancestors, is minimal, right?
Yeah,
It's like they never existed,
right,
right? So there's a lot of connections with, like, even in here, changing of the name, stripping of the religion, like separation of families, all of that will happen in Puerto Rico with our ancestors, and not only Puerto Rico, but the Caribbean as well, right? And everything, and that we see is rooted as well in resistance. Many people were able to kind of unpack and continue pushing forward, even though there were so many threats of whitening the race. And when I was mentioning that idea that my grandmother was very, passionate about, it was not her fault. I couldn't understand it until, Melanie brought it to the table, right? It was a mindset that was given by the government of that the best journey for Puerto Rico, it was to be whitened. What does that mean when we are in 2023 and we have these laws in Puerto Rico that incentivize people to go to the island and strip it out and push their people out?
right,
It haven't changed. So we see that still there are so many connections, not only with enslavement, because people are, literally working their lives with the minimum, right? And having to tolerate a lot of, things that we're going to think, like, it's like, wow, this is very, we cannot live through these conditions because it's a lot with the prices of everything, with buying food, like having sustainable living spaces, like so many things, right? That you will think, like, it's like it has been the plan of overall white supremacy in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean to ensure that we erase who we are, that we erase, that we don't understand, that we disconnect from our, essence and our history. So for me, that, this is a very interesting question, because I cannot just leave it in the past without acknowledging what is happening today in the island and what have is happening in the past 120 something years after the invasion of the United States in Puerto Rico, because it continued perpetuating this idea of erasure.
right.
And to be honest with you, like, like having this idea of the three races is not helping unpack and helping people get activated to fight that.
Yeah, I remember maybe last year seeing a ad for like a runaway slave in Puerto Rico that was in Spanish. And, you know, much the same way you might see it as part of like an African American history textbook here in the United States. And that was like one of the first times that I was like, oh, yeah, like, where's all of that? Where does it exist? And why don't we talk about that, right? In the same ways that those conversations happen here, in terms of like the reckoning that happens with that history, or at least the attempted reckoning. Jackie, for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this subject of erasure in Puerto Rico takes on a lot of complexity when we think about, you know, to your point, Brenda, every yes to everything that you said, you know, to the point where, you know, the first non-Indigenous women on the island for a very long time were Black women that were, you know, serving the sailors and the military, you know, the military, and it was, you know, it was a military post, and that was their role, you know, to wash the clothes and to, you know, la mondonguera, and, you know, there was a role for Black women in that society. But you know, I think it's really important at this point in time to talk about the insidious erasure of Indigenous women, right? Because I'm part of a generation that grew up believing that if I spoke about my Taino roots, I was trying to deny my Blackness, right? So politics is really complicated in Puerto Rico because for, you know, centuries we've been taught to believe that we had no Indigenous roots left, right? That the Tainos were annihilated within 100 years of the conquest. You know, all it took was a little bit of science in the last 10 years, right? A little bit of genetic testing that everybody is so, you know, indebted to now in our interest in genealogy, to discover that wasn't the case, that we are by and large Indigenous people whose genetic you know, base was complicated, right, by those that came later. So, you know, I think that's really important, right? That's actually one of the things that I'm intrigued by terminology and the politics of identity. I understand that it's our way of coping, you know, with the complications that we ourselves have created, right? So, and I know that there was a lot of resistance to the term BIPOC, for example, Black, Indigenous, people of color, but I honored, right? And I had to like really reflect on how important it was to put Black and Indigenous identities at the forefront, right, of who we can be. So that's really important too. We spent a lot of time erasing that, and it made things very difficult to us. Just to address the question, yes, it made it very difficult for us to then come to a new society, right, where race was understood differently, and we embrace Hispanic. So it's not even just about erasing; it's about uplifting. You know, to Marlon's point before, I actually hadn't thought about it that way, but it's like the Spanish and the Portuguese were really committed to making everybody Spanish and Portuguese at the end of the day. And that's different, right? Like, I don't think the Brits were interested in that. I don't think the British were necessarily interested in that. I don't know. I could be wrong. I'm a historian, really I am, but that wasn't my jam, right? Like that I think that was different. And again, to the point where we bought this term Hispanic, right? At the detriment of everything else that we were. And so that not only made it complicated for us, but it made it complicated for everybody else too, right? To the point where they're like, well, what are y'all? What do you want to be called? Latino, Hispanic? What are you? You know? And we're just kind of like, we're Hispanic, I guess, right? So it complicated things for everyone because there was never a conversation about like who we are, like how we understand ourselves racially, right? Like we just all get lumped together and we're like, but there's more to us, right? Like there's complexity in who we are. And I don't show up the same way as somebody with lighter skin or somebody with darker skin in any space, in any society, right? So yeah, so there, I think that the ¿cómo se dice? La falta, the problem was ours, but it's also everybody else's, right? Like we all lost from this, a very unfortunate, you know, erasure.
Yeah.
So this is important work. Like this is important. I mean, not all is lost. Like the fact is that we have gained enormous ground in the last few years. Like before that too, I honor the work that everybody, we're talking about, and how much we're able to look back and see that there was something to celebrate, about Blackness in our past. But like also in the last few years, the uprisings, even in 2020, like that shifted so much. We're talking about, Afro-Latinidad, Afro-Boricua identities. We're talking about identities in such a complex way in this moment in time. And that's fantastic. I want to recognize that too, and applaud, especially like younger people who have been really, putting in a lot of time when it comes to like making identities like even more complex and trying to kind of break through all of those boundaries that haven't allowed us to talk about like, just truly like intersectional identities, not just like what we've been saying so far, gender, sexuality, all of it.
Yeah. It makes me think a lot about like how powerful the Black Lives Matter movement was, not only here in the States, but worldwide, right? You saw also these uprisings in Latin America, and the fact that it was like identified around Black, and that Black is not just African American, it's not just Afro Puerto Rican, right? But that it is this Black identity across continents, I think was really powerful in saying like this is anti-Blackness that exists all over the world because of the, as products of colonialism, right? And the ways that we continue to manifest that. And again, like, pushing up against this myth, at least on the island, about like we're all the same, or if it's the discrimination is based more on class than it is on race, right? Which we know that's not true, but it nuanced the conversation in ways that it hadn't been before. So I think like as we go ahead, Marlon. Did somebody want to say something?
Huh?
Did you want to say
No,
something?
well, I'm just listening.
So the last question that at least I have as part of this is, what work do we have to do in the Latinx community to address anti-Blackness, and what kinds of solidarity work do we have to engage with the African American community to bring about more collaboration and support around issues that are important to both communities? Jackie.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, well, first of all, I think that we have to honor the work that has already been done, for sure, right? Like, I don't ever want to suggest, there's always progress, and with each generation, more is accomplished, right? And I don't ever want to give into this idea that somehow, like, we're starting from scratch, we are building this on the shoulders of our ancestors, and they've put in a lot of work to get us to this point to be able to even speak about all these things. So first and foremost is like restoring the past. I love, Marlon, that you started out with the information about redlining in Boston. I'm a New Englander too at heart, and I had no idea about that, rich history in Boston around that particular church. And it just so happens that my research is very similar to that in Chicago. I study the roots of the Young Lords organization in the community of Lincoln Park, which was once a very vibrant, which was one of the first kind of Puerto Rican enclaves, like barrios, in the city of Chicago. And you wouldn't know it right now, right? Because it was just heavily gentrified, and is now one of the wealthiest, widest communities in the city of Chicago, and very much a product of Chicago redlining, right? So my job right now is to kind of, repair that history, right? So I really think that that reparations work when it comes to history is very important, so that we can remember, the solidarities, right? Like the Young Lords movement was above all, like the lesson from it was solidarity with African Americans, solidarity with poor whites at the time through the Rainbow Coalition with the Black Panther Party of Illinois. So that's really important, is for us to remember that we have worked together in the past, right? Like that we do have a history of coalitions that have been very powerful and were destroyed because they were powerful, right? So we definitely have to remember how powerful and what a challenge to to the status quo solidarity is. So we can't, while we're honoring identities and and especially ones, working through difference, which I think is really important, we can't lose sight of just how powerful solidarity is. So, my hope is that we can continue to collaborate, when it, either politically or socially and culturally, to find those moments of juncture, and then understand and be okay when it's time for us to have to, huddle amongst ourselves to solve problems, and to, check in with ourselves about what we're doing right and what we could improve on. So, I think that both can be done. I think that we can honor our, our individual identities, and then find ways to work together so that we can remember who the enemy is. Right?
Mhm.
Because at the end of the day, like, the marathon of oppressions is not going to get us anywhere, right?
Mhm.
It's not going to help us grow. I think that we can work through differences, and do a whole lot better, when it comes to changing the things that need to be changed.
I agree.
Brenda?
I definitely agree. Thank you, Jackie, for that. I think it's super important to honor everything and the work that has been done, the struggles, right, the challenges, understanding them and put them on the front, burner as we do this work. For me, it's also very important when we're talking about solidarity to look in the past and the present and the future, right? Because there's a lot work that have been done, but there's also a lot of work that needs to be done. And I see as the present as a continuum, right? That we continue looking not only back and forward, but on the sides, right? Who is walking with us? Who has the potential of walking with us? Who we can embrace in a process of empathy, in compassion, right? Because as we ask for people to understand where we're coming from, it's also a process for us to kind of open up. And I know I'm very, my pride for and love for Puerto Rico is immense, right? And the pride and love for my Puerto Rican community in Chicago is also very immense. But I also understand that the work that we need to be done, or the work that I need to be done, is beyond that. It's not geographically, it's not block by block, but it's like, is generational as well. So even though that I work a lot with youth, most of my work has been centered in youth. I've been also very invested in training them in talking to their elders, right? And what information they can bring forward from the past into the future, and really give it a continuum to that process. I also feel that working with teachers as well has been very important, getting them the resources, the toolkits, the information to kind of embrace this process of solidarity within the classrooms, right? From very small ages. What does that mean to have this balance between feeling pride for your culture, but also at the same time embracing this culture of solidarity with others? We added one more part of the solidarity, that is the process of healing. We have internalized and we have eaten so much colonization and like racism in so many different ways, and sexism and homophobia, transphobia in so many different ways and forms. So it's like, as we do this work as cultural workers, as we do this work as anti-racists and abolitionists, right? When do we take care of ourselves, right? When do we take care of understanding and looking back and celebrating ourselves of our achievements, right? And our how far we have come. And I think that's a balance that I feel like is also part of understanding, because when people engage in this work, they always say like, oh, it's always so bad, it's always so terrible, that we only talking about sadness and stuff, and people refuse because it's painful, it's traumatic, right? It's traumatic. So how do we ensure that our communities are well versed in understanding and unpacking that trauma, right? And so it's like affirming solidarity and healing for me as we move forward, looking at this as a continuum.
Yeah. That's why I think like even the connection to music across our communities is an important connection point and space for healing and creativity. Marlene or Jackie?
No, I just wanted to, add that there's another subtext here that I think is really powerful about this moment that I'm going to walk away from with a lot of like appreciation for, which is that, even spaces like this, like it's so rare to be able to have a conversation amongst women who identify as Afro-Puerto Rican. Like we've been in the Afro-Latino spaces a lot, but I think that there is a nuance, a really important nuance to being able to like sit together and come at this conversation from such different perspectives too, even amongst ourselves, like our own differences, like whether it's our experiences, whether it's our cultural upbringing, whether it's the differences, in our foods and the things that we ate and how we've experienced Blackness. Like those conversations are so important, and those forums there haven't been spaces for this. So these are healing spaces, and these, that we're letting others in on, right? So these healing spaces, these opportunities to talk, have to be understood that way too, right? As these are some of the first times sometimes for us, right, to be able to sit around with other Puerto Rican women. Puerto Ricans are racialized at the end of the day, whether or not you can go all day saying like it's the whitest country in the Caribbean, but when we landed here, we were immediately racialized. And in Latin America, we're racialized, right? So, we have to have these conversations amongst ourselves too, so that we can then let others in and work through that.
So Marlon, thank you for creating the space for us.
Thank you. That was good. Thank you.
You guys, thank you. No, because that's the whole part of restorative. You create a safe space, and then when to hear you just connect with that like immediately so strongly, I mean, I was just like, yes, that's what it was for. Because thank you. I really thank you. One of the things I wanted to just tell you, like one of the things I've like been just soaking it all in. I really feel like to understand the Caribbean, that video, I know I should have played it, but it was like, it really talked about how the food was influenced, and it sounded like a whirlwind of movement and unnatural, like race mixing, just like the wind that flows through from the hurricane. It's like that's how everybody was for 100 years. I mean, that was the engine that now diverted slaves from, to the north, to the south, from that, the ports, right? So is this like, I feel like you're kind of a victim of multiculturalism, but you're like way advanced than most of us, because they're like, you're all like the mixture of the Tayano, of the, the Indian, I'm sure everything's in there because everybody has been moving through that area for like, without that, there is no Brazil, there is no America slavery. Everything starts in the Caribbean, like a big lagoon. So that's the one thing I love about it. And I think that I'm understanding it a whole lot more. And then the women perspective, and then the religious perspective. I got so much to unpack. I'm going to just turn off now, but I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart and for all my students, because I'm just salivating over what we're going to put together based on these conversations. The kids are going to listen to this. And a lot of my students are ladies. That's another thing. These men, I don't know. They gotta step up their game, because the ladies are taking them out. Easy pickings, and so they will really appreciate having this conversation. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
Appreciate the time. And Jackie and Brenda, thank you so much for accepting the invitation and being in this space together.
Anytime.
My divine pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, don't worry about that. Oh my goodness, I'm clicking through. Forgot. Are we done? All right.